You're listening to What's Ray Saying, the podcast. You know, people are still highly segregated about race in the funeral business. Not many funeral homes are experienced in providing traditional funerals, excluding cremations for all races. Now, for a good deal of my early life, before I left home and joined the Army, we lived behind a funeral home, where at nights I could find myself compelled to look out the back window to see if the light was on, meaning at night they were working. On most occasions, the window was shut and covered with a type of frosted glass that made it impossible to see in. But on occasion, very rare occasions, maybe once or twice a year, the window would be open. I would be home. I would be looking, and a body was being prepared. I could see the process. I saw the very same people I knew in life from around the way, right there inside the funeral home, painted, decorated in that odd way, filled with things that have their unmistakable aroma of preservation, formaldehyde. I recall the times my sister Janice and I went inside to test our nerve, look at a body and run out. How my sister Carolyn attended services for people she barely knew or just heard of. The number of times I saw people who had died within a block of the funeral home, right there inside. And I remember how there was always a sad sense of avoidance associated with those who were too poor to bury their dead, had to beg for money in cups around barber shops, and beauty parlors, churches, to pay for a funeral. Not being able to have a standard funeral regardless of the cost was looked down on and came with a sense of shame for the family involved. Do black lives really matter? How much do they matter to black people, to you, to America, to anybody? Does it depend? Do you need some context to answer that question? From the source of all black knowledge, looking to increase the dosage of my antidepressant medication, working on getting close air support, wishing I had my hands on a flamethrower, pushing on with the writing of my dissertation and wishing for the soft and succulent taste of a fried bologna sandwich. You're listening to What's Ray Saying? I'm Ray Christian. In a moment, 2 narratives and a commentary.
Hey folks, this is Kevin Allison. I host the podcast Risk, where people tell true stories they never thought they'd dare to share. Risk is a little bit like some of the storytelling shows you might have heard on NPR, but we're completely uncensored. So we feature stories that are too emotional, too sexual, or too scary, or too controversial, or outrageous, or whatever for broadcast radio. When Risk first brought our touring show to North Carolina, Ray Christian shared a story on that show. He's on the Risk episode called Live from Chapel Hill with an incredible story called Comfortable in the Water. I was blown away, not just by Ray's realness, but by his depth. His heart and soul are in that storytelling. Then on Live from Chapel Hill 2, Ray shared a story called Child's Play. It was Unbelievable. So surprising and outrageous. And on a recent Risk episode called Perception, Ray tells another one called The Candyman. So powerful. I'll tell you one thing, Ray has a poet's spirit and he's lived one hell of a fascinating life. I've gotten to know Ray as a friend over the years, and he's just as solid a man one-on-one as he is on stage. It's thrilling to see that Ray is putting all his passion and poetry into creating his own podcast now, What Ray's Saying. So keep listening as this new podcast grows over time, and tell your friends about it too. I think we're all going to feel like Humphrey Bogart did when he uttered the final line in Casablanca, "This is the beginning of a beautiful friendship."
Blacks who died on plantations were typically buried at night by fellow slaves, if allowed at all, to avoid missing work during daylight. Many were disposed of in makeshift graves with a simple marker where their bones may have been dug up to serve as souvenirs or macabre decorations. Most were simply forgotten. Following slavery, many blacks who died without family or were with family that were poor would be used as medical cadavers and or disposed of without any formal burial. The majority of black convicts who died in custody as a result of abuse or maltreatment or disease were disposed of in common graves. By the turn of the 20th century, there were few locations in America that allowed for the proper burial of blacks, especially in proximity to whites. Now, there were exceptions in some limited way in public cemeteries, but I speak to the common and everyday practice of separation by race. The use of embalming that was in widespread use in America in the late 1900s, allowing for family and friends to travel distances in time to see the deceased before burial. But this modern practice was not an option for most blacks. White funeral homes generally refused to offer services to blacks, even if they could afford it. The general attitude being that allowing blacks would take away from the dignified services they would be offering to whites, as most whites considered it degrading to have the remains of their loved ones reduced to having to lay where blacks would be. These attitudes and the greater availability of embalming supplies resulted in a unique opportunity for black entrepreneurs who operated funeral services that catered directly to blacks, now allowing initially an upper class the same services as whites. Now, while in time this practice became marginally available to the black middle class because of reduction in cost, unfortunately, very early on, blacks who could hardly afford the cost of a modern funeral felt compelled to have higher-end funerals to demonstrate their love, driven by shame or not being able to have and provide in life. Maybe they could do something in death. A captured audience of blacks was exploited, who had limited options in their grief, while still there were others who found themselves forever indebted or loyal to a funeral home owner that worked with them, that helped them through hard financial times to bury their loved one. This resulted in a level of prestige and, especially for many of these black funeral directors, a high level of influence in the black community. Many of them became major players in community relationships and politics. In response to the death of those they loved, blacks have and still from the days of slavery when allowed any opportunity to express themselves, emote, cry, wail, screech, and howl outwardly and openly at funerals, considered less dignified and primal by many whites. And the things I have seen with my own eyes on numerous occasions, black people so consumed with grief, so inconsolable, they began pulling at the body, yelling out the name of the dead person, trying to climb inside the casket. Such is the level of pain. Throughout the decades, the collective memory of blacks has been eroded by the systematic destruction and removal of black cemeteries across America, supported by law and social and political indifference, making ways to build new roadways, highways, parking lots, apartment complexes, other developments. Many of these early black cemeteries were desecrated and removed to unknown locations. The graves of my own grandparents, who died in the 1940s and 50s, can never be found. If I had a sponsor, the spot would go right here. If I had a sponsor, the spot would go right here. Example. Plain ribs are good, but sometimes you could use a little sauce. Talk with your doctor first to see if you're healthy enough to have any raised sauce. Side effects may include the desire to be spanked, getting in a hot tub with a stranger or monkeys. Effects lasting more than 3 days require immediate medical attention. If I had a sponsor, the spot would go right here. End. The woman felt a strong and uncontrollable desire to show up, and the rumors and speculations heard in whispered, soft and not-so-subtle tones about the woman whose status was not spoken of were quieted only when she arrived, dressed in black, with a hat whose brim was larger than that of any other woman in the church. Her arrival was more anticipated than that of the dead pastor's wife and kids. The silence was only broken when she walked in by the tap of her heels, followed shortly and softly from the back of the room. That hoe. She was the pastor's last special assistant, in whose company he was with when he died. He died at her place, an apartment he maintained for her benefit. It was said that he died suddenly, naked, and cleanly showered of a sudden heart attack. One of his daughters was called to come over to check on him before the ambulance was called. He was a great dresser in life, and he was outfitted with a suit that matched the color of his green casket, that matched his taste and style in life. The woman walked to the front of the church, leaned over the casket and sobbed, falling to her knees and cried out, "I love you, I love you. I don't care what they say about me. Oh Lord, why did you take him away from me?" A man ran up to her side and tried lifting and comforting her in her grief. "It's okay. It's okay." He attempted to escort her to a seat further in the back of the church. The pastor's wife then stood up and walked slowly to the casket and cried softly, touched and kissed his face. Sobbing uncontrollably, she said, "What a wonderful man. My baby. My husband. My husband. My husband." She was quickly tended to by her daughters, who helped her, shaking, back to her seat. The woman turned around and walked back to the casket and yelled, "Why did you have to go? Why did you have to go?" She stood at the casket. The wife stood up again, and she walked back to the casket. They both stood there, side by side. Slowly, through their tears and anguish, pushing each other by inches away from the center place of the casket, back and forth, with their bodies at first, slowly at first. The pace got quicker, then with hands, then with shoving and pushing. Each of them had others stand up and attempt to pull them away. But each of them would scream out and pull back and direct their attention back to the preacher, swearing their love. The organist continued her playing and in some way may have influenced the rhythm of the women and their pushing against each other. Now settled and back to their seats after more than 30 minutes had passed, the woman stood up and decided to go off program. She wanted to speak a few words about the pastor after the eulogy and after his favorite hymn was played. But as she tried to speak, her words were drowned out by the wailing of the pastor's wife and kids. You could only see her lips moving. After the service, the woman, for some unknown reason, maybe a lack of communications, tried to enter and was refused entry into the family car and pushed down to the ground by some unseen hand, exposing her slip and underwear as she laid on the ground. The convoy of cars with the lights on drove off to the cemetery. The way people are treated in death is a reflection on how they are remembered and were thought about in life. I can't count the number of times I've seen it or heard on conservative news outlets just how quick they are to analyze the worth of a black life and their assessment of the right and wrong of the killing first. You know, the only thing that keeps me sane some days is the knowledge that I know some white people who think differently. The racism I've personally experienced, despite any perceived successes in my life, and there ain't been many, have always been blunted and beaten back into shape by some positive encounter with white people that keeps me from going on a path of complete destruction and calling for the end of all life, including my own. I got used to the constant back and forth that has given me the proper perspective. But even I have reached a point where I am in need of much bending to keep me in shape right now. Well, this one is done. So, let me hear from you. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and at What's Ray Saying and what'sraysaying.com. I need to hear from you. I want to hear from you. Trust me, if you don't support the show, nobody will. 8 more episodes left in this first season. Then we'll take a look at it and see where it goes from there. The show was produced by me. I'm sorry for that. It was an accident. Special thanks to Dr. T and my dear, dear friend, the always amazing Mr. Kevin Allison of The Risk Show. Music in this episode was provided by Blues Raiders' Dream Infirmary, with original beats by the always amazing Beach Gordy Brooks. Well, Ray's heading out. Until next time.
You have been listening to What's Ray Saying, the podcast, hosted by Ray Christian. You can find What's Ray Saying on iTunes, Facebook, and Twitter. If you've got comments, questions, or feedback, you can always reach us via Facebook or by emailing what'sraysaying@gmail.com. Ray says each episode is made with love, fatback, chicken feed, and fresh mountain spring water, but none of these are legal tender according to the electric company. To help this listener-supported podcast pay the bills and keep producing episodes like the one you just heard, you can click on our Donate tab on Facebook or go to paypal.me/what'sraysaying. Tell a friend or 2 or 12 or 20 what you just heard on What's Ray Saying, the podcast. Until next time.